positive impact on my life and are among the finest human beings I've ever known. And so Nick was certainly one, and Peter is the other. Peter and Olivia both have contributed in 1,000 ways, financially, politically, socially, gracefully, to Santa Rosa as a community, Sonoma County, and also to Santa Rosa Junior College. There are scholarships with their names and students who have profited substantially from their gracious gifting. There are many things about Pete that I love, but I think most I love that Peter never misses a chance to help somebody that needs help, both financially and in a million other ways, and Leveque has done the same. So at the risk of embarrassment, I'd like to ask you to stand, Pete, and Olivia, please, would you mind standing? And I'd like to thank you again. Thank you. It is, in fact, such a pleasure, you don't get too often in the same evening, to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. David Lumberg, who has just recently stepped away from his position as a full professor in the Department of Integrated Biology at the University of California, Berkeley. He was also a curator in the Museum for Paleontology. David's academic history is fairly easy, and one of the reasons it's so much fun to be around him and talk to him about stuff is because he was a community college student himself. He was a student at Diablo Valley College in the early part of his career, and from there went to San Francisco State University, where he finished, and then went to the University of California at Santa Cruz, where he finished his doctorate, and then on to Berkeley. He is the author of a numerous number of books, and also editor of a number of specialty books in bird biology, paleontology, and also the author of on the order of 150 refereed scientific journal articles, which is 149 more than I have. It's really a great feeling to have David here. I consider him a very good friend. He is certainly a friend of worth. He is a scholar of reputation and note, and additionally, a very fine gentleman. I would offer that we are now in our almost third decade of the Peter Leveque lecture, and we pay people to give these lectures a lot. That's not actually true, but it's reasonable. And in all the history of the lecture series, David refused to take the honorarium for this and asked that we turn it back into student scholarships. So it's with pleasure then that I introduce to you Dr. David Lumberg, who will speak to us about the Bering Sea Chronicles, or as you see on the screen, the history of marine mammals. David, please.
After an introduction like that, I probably shouldn't say anything and just go to questions. Thank you very much, Bob. For those of you that know me, and there are a few in this room, I'm probably much more known for my work in marine invertebrates, and in particular, this funny group of snails that live on the rocks called limpets. Now, everyone who works on some organism always wants to know what Darwin said about their organism. I mean, we scour the origin, we scour the logs to basically find out what Darwin said about our animals. What insight did Charles Darwin get from our animals? This is the only thing Charles Darwin ever said about limpets. So, and as you look here in this little sort of wordle cloud of my papers, there isn't much about marine mammals either. So I'm sort of moving away here a little bit. But I have enablers. I have very good enablers that basically, through my entire career, provided insights, discussions, and different ways of seeing the marine mammal world. Jim Estes, formerly with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and now at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Oh, boy, I just went totally blank on Dan Costa's name. Dan Costa, who was in graduate school with me and is today probably one of the world's experts on pinnipeds. Terry Williams, also at UC Santa Cruz. And my most recent enabler, Nick Peinson, one of my graduate students who just finished a few years ago and is now curator at the Smithsonian in paleobiology, studying cetaceans and marine mammals. You may have seen some of Nick's work just about a year and a half ago when he excavated a large whale fall in Chile that was being overrun by a highway. And just fabulous work. And of course, my other enabler is the Bering Sea itself, where I've had the pleasure of spending a lot of time getting to know the organisms and the communities up there. This is the Bering Sea. This is the physical environment, sort of demarcated in the south by the Aleutian Islands, the Commander Islands and Attu, the western Aleutians, sort of bringing up the west, most of the Alaska Peninsula coming down, and the rest of Alaska coming up to the Bering Strait, and then sort of the Pribilof Islands sitting here. And I bring these up just so we sort of have a geographical bearing, sort of setting the stage for the players and the actors that will basically be discussed here today. And these are the actors. These are some of the actors. The Bering Sea is incredible in terms of its marine mammal diversity. It's absolutely amazing. Some are extinct, such as our stellar sea cow here. Other ones have come back from the brink of extinction, such as the sea otter, the fursia, and some may in fact be facing extinction now as we look at what's going to be happening to the walrus with the loss of sea ice over the next few decades. These aren't all the marine mammals, but these are some of them, and there's some of them I'd like to sort of revisit tonight with a slightly different approach to thinking about their biology and their ecology. When we look at an organism or the habitat in which that organism lives in, we're typically dealing with this realm of ecology. And it basically builds through this hierarchy from the actual organisms to their populations, communities, ecosystems. Very straightforward way of organizing and thinking about our data. And tonight we'll be working through the organisms I just introduced you to. They have different populations, such as the stellar sea cow at the Commander Islands, the sea otters at Amchitka, or the sea otters in Clam Cove on Adak Island. These are populations come together from these different organisms and form these communities, the kelp forests, the benthos, and the rocky shore communities. And then together, we've sort of delimited them with the Bering Sea. What's interesting about this hierarchy is it's all based on the recent. It's all what's happening right now. There's no time in this hierarchy. It is just a snapshot of where are the sea otters, what habitat are they in, and maybe how many there are if you're looking at their population. But there's another way of thinking about this data and thinking about these hierarchies, and that's basically to bring time in. This is from Tom Schaaf's very early paleobiology work back in the 1970s. And this is some of the earliest thinking about how do we bring the fossil record, how do we bring time into our study of organisms, communities, species, and the regions and provinces they work in. This is a very deceptive diagram because it is just packed with so much information. Across the bottom, on the log scale, we're basically running from minutes all the way up to 4.5 billion years. A huge amount of time accounted for on the scale across the bottom. And so when we look at an individual, most individuals live between a day and a little over a century. We also have bacteria, of course, which are having generation times, which are turning over in minutes. And we have very long-lived things, such as bristlecone pines, which may be up here into the thousands of years. We can do the same thing with communities. And also notice on the Y scale, we have the area from a centimeter squared all the way up to the surface area of the Earth. So what we've done here is basically brought time and space together into a single diagram. And we can take that same ecological hierarchy and we can move through this as we try to understand the interactions. It's a little more tricky, but we now have time and we can benefit from the past and bring the past into the present, as well as use it to predict perhaps the future. I want to do a sidebar here just to sort of give you an idea. 2010, I went to a meeting in Antwerp, in Brussels. And one thing that happens, those of you that go to scientific meetings find this out very quickly, is about halfway through the meeting they usually have a culture day, when they get all the scientists out of the room, put them on buses, and take them someplace to basically have a cultural and social experience. There's no meetings that day, everybody's out on the buses. So they took us out, we went and we basically visited a bunch of lowland towns. And one of the things about the towns that struck me were all the canals. These are mostly canal towns. So when I got back, I decided that I would write a little thing up for my dad, where I'd been, what I did. So I went to Google Earth and I basically Googled some of the towns that we had visited. Amsterdam here in the Netherlands, Bruges in Belgium, Delft, again in the Netherlands, and Leiden in the Netherlands. And it was when I was putting this together for my father that I noticed something. The history of the towns is visible from space, from Google Earth. Here's Amsterdam. Notice that Amsterdam is built on the bay, and notice that the old town is primarily canals which come in from the bay and come back down, and the streets are basically all organized in this horizontal way. You see the same thing in Delft, with the canals coming straight off the old river here, where Delft was basically founded. And as these come in, sometimes there's cross connections, but for the most part, you go down and back like one-way streets. But look at Newtown in Amsterdam. Suddenly, we have spokes going across the canals. You no longer have to go all the way out and back down. You can basically cross a spoke, much more efficient. This is the history of Amsterdam, as seen from space. Bruges, they took the river and they turned it into a moat around the city. Bruges is a walled city. There's a few canals that come in and service the center part, but for the most part, the river is just diverted into the moat. Leiden's my favorite. Look at the history here. Here's the confluence of the two rivers in which Leiden was basically founded. Here's the moat around the first walled city of Leiden. And look at the second wall and moat around Leiden. The characteristic sawtooth of a wall which basically reflects the technology of medieval fort building. Here's one of the towers, another tower here. Basically, Leiden expanded. They expanded the moat. They redirected the rivers. And you basically see that history from Google Earth. Walking around any of these towns, you do not see that history. That history is not apparent. Yes, it's a canal city. It's there. But what I hope I've done is basically convince you that pulling back to larger scales gives us different information, different ways of seeing the same thing. Now, you have to be specific in what you decide to do in terms of the question you ask. For example, I don't think I would use this approach if I wanted to count the number of bicycles in Leiden or Amsterdam. But if I want to count the number of bicycles and estimate abundance, I'm going to be down at this level. So your resolution changes as you move through these different scales. And moving through these scales is what I really want to look at in terms of marine mammals tonight. What happens when we expand the scale? And it isn't just that ecological hierarchy that we're looking at. Why would we want to do this? Because most of the things we're interested in, particularly in global change biology, are things which happen on scales in which we never ever have a study which is going to pick it up. Maybe a species invasion, maybe we catch the tail end of an extinction, but the community changes as well as the speciation events cannot be derived from relatively short-term studies. And this is kind of deceptive because most ecological studies, or the longest ones, are about as long as the average PhD. About 4.5, 5 years. That is the time frame. We're way down here. The fossil record, however, gives us much deeper time, and particularly this piece here in the Pleistocene, the last ice ages, basically gives us insights into the processes that ecology wants to decipher, but doesn't have the time perspective to basically get at. So let's look at some of these marine mammals in the Bering Sea, and let's look at their history, and let's see what we can derive from changing that scale, changing that resolution. So we do have dugongs in the Pacific. Of course, we don't today, but again, we want that deeper look. What is their history? What have they been doing? The dugongs first appear in the Miocene about 25 million years ago. And they're a huge global diversity. They're literally worldwide. In California, we have fossils such as this one excavated by my museum at Berkeley, at the UCMP by Sam Wells in Santa Cruz. Beautiful specimen living along the Santa Cruz shoreline. Not that long ago, at least not that long ago from a paleo perspective, and also in San Diego. They had extensive distributions in all these warm tropical waters. But as the climate cooled, as we came out of the Miocene, and we started cooling down the world, their distributions shrank. So today, we think of dugongs, we think of Africa, we think of Indonesia, we think of northern Australia. We don't think of dugongs in cold water, nor do we think of them as being outside of this tropical area. However, there was one, Hydrodramulus, stellar sea cow genus, which first appears just 5.1 million years ago. Not that long. It isn't the Bering, even though we refer to it as stellars and it's associated with Bering and his shipwreck in the Commander Islands, this is an animal which had a range from California through Japan. We've recovered the fossils. We've also recovered it from the middens of the Aleutians and the middens of Alaska. Native Americans hunted and basically took stellar sea cows throughout the Aleutians and throughout Alaska. And it was a nice piece of meat. You know, this is an animal which is about 20 to 30 feet long. It is a dugong. It's coming out of a group which was primarily tropical. And so the way it ends up surviving in the cold water is to basically load up with blubber. So much blubber that the animals could not dive. They had to feed on the surface, and that's why the Aleutians, the California coast, the Japanese coast, all through British Columbia with the kelp beds, made it an ideal habitat. And these animals were widely distributed. But they couldn't dive, which basically meant they were easy prey for very, very crude hunting techniques. All you had to do was get out in the water and find a way to spear or club this animal. You didn't really have to hunt it like you'd say a whale or maybe even a stellar sea lion. So it was impacted very quickly by people. And by the time that this Bering comes along on his two cruises, the first one up, discovery of the Bering Straits, the second cruise out to Alaska and through the Aleutian Islands and back to the Commander Islands. Basically, the animals are completely restricted at this point in time to the Commander Islands. They have been eradicated from the Aleutians, from mainland Alaska, from Kamchatka, Sakhalin, Hokkaido, Japan, by overhunting, by Aboriginal people. They're already restricted to this little 2 islands off the coast of Russia. Bering has his vessels wrecked there in 1741. The islands are named for him in terms of being the commander of the expedition. And this is when the sea cows were discovered. They had a red veal-like meat, and their fat, when the fat was rendered, it was, just amazing stuff. It burned without odor. It did not even smoke. So for a shipwreck crew, this is like having a Costco. You basically have everything imaginable in this one animal. The meat kept well, and basically you could feed about 30 people for a month. So even though they spent about 1.5 years here before moving and getting longboats and getting back to Russia without Bering, they basically told about their discoveries, about the Aleutians, about the Commander Islands, and within 25 years, the Steller sea cow was extinct. The name Steller comes from the naturalist, the natural historian who accompanied Bering on this expedition. And in addition to the Steller sea cow, we also, of course, have the Steller sea lion, also named by and for George Steller. So we lose the Steller sea cow very recently, actually. If you think about it, just a little over 200 years and change. But it had already been overhunted throughout the North Pacific. And this was the last place it was surviving when it was discovered by the Russians. There's been some just elegant work done by Steininger in 1887. The great thing that we benefit so much in the natural history world from is the fact of the capitalism associated with both whaling and furs. These were expensive undertakings to send out an expedition. Usually it was the crown that did that, or the czar. But if you were a commercial concern and you wanted to go get furs from Alaska or from the coast of Russia, you basically had to have an underwriter. And boy, what they wanted was records. Where did you go? How many otters did you see? How many whales did you attempt to take? Because these were businessmen, and they wanted an accounting for every cent that was basically spent hunting marine mammals. So there are wonderful records of the number of sea cows that were taken by the various expeditions that basically stopped at the Commander Islands. And by going back through these records, which were first brought together in 1887, applying a standard population biology model to them, we can basically predict whether or not overhunting or something else was responsible for the loss of the sea otters. That something else that has been proposed was the fact that the people that came here to basically provision up or spend time on the Commander Islands were after sea otters. They were basically taking sea otter furs. And of course, as you know, and we'll mention in a few seconds here, the sea otters controlled the kelp. If in fact the sea otters were removed by overhunting, you would have the sea urchins come in, wipe out the kelp, and our Steller sea cows would starve to death. So which one was it? Was it overhunting? Was it the loss of the kelp beds because of all of these groups coming in to basically take sea otters? It was a very close call, but it turns out this hunting alone is sufficient. As a matter of fact, given the different criteria, whether or not they were killed and consumed immediately, they were killed and carried aboard a ship to be taken to Alaska as provisions, they were killed for immediate consumption, but then it was wasted meat, it wasn't eaten, or whether it was killed for provisions but wasted. Depending on the criteria here, you can basically actually have the Steller sea cow disappearing before it actually did, just on overhunting alone. So in this case, it looks like what befell the Steller sea cow on the commanders was the same thing that happened to it earlier with Aboriginal people hunting in Alaska, the Aleutians, and along the coast of Russia and Japan. Probably because these animals had started, this is where their history becomes so far. You're talking about a tropical animal coming into the cool area as it cools off and loading up with blubber, which meant it couldn't dive. And that was the beginning of the end at that point. So we loot our Steller sea cow. The furs were not responsible. It does look like it was overhunting. And the Encyclopedia Britannica should change this picture because it clearly gives us the idea that there is some sort of communion going on here. And this is not. The Aleuts who did most of the hunting through the Aleutians were marvelous maritime hunters. Except when you read the old anthropological records from Attu and some of the Western Aleutians, the legends basically include references that hunting Steller sea cows was woman's work because it was so easy to kill them. You didn't have to send a whole canoe out as if you were going after whales. But the Steller sea cow was gone. The arrival of us in the system, in the Bering Sea, was huge. And we really didn't have an understanding of how big that impact was until John Erlandson at Oregon published a paper with a group of colleagues in 2011, which basically coined the term the kelp highway. Up until this point, our basic ideas of the colonization of North America had to do with people coming over the Bering Land Bridge and then down between the glaciers into North America. The problem was the dates in South America, the dates in North America are long before the corridor opens up. So people are here before there's an ice-free way to get them into North America. And John Erlandson, primarily based on his work on Santa Rosa and San Miguel Island in Southern California, started realizing that these fine fish and seabird arrowheads that he was finding in Daisy Cave were identical to similar artifacts from Japan, Hokkaido, and up into the western areas of Asia here. These were maritime people. These were people that hunted whales, hunted Steller sea cows, took sea otters. These were outstanding maritime people. And John made the hypothesis that they basically followed the kelp beds. Why not? The kelp beds are loaded with food. There's sea otters there for furs. You've got fish that come into the kelp forests. You basically have a sustainable population, another Costco, all the way over into North America. And this has gotten a lot of traction now. That basically, as we look at more and more sites, we really are seeing this maritime kelp highway, which means that the kelp forests in this area of the Aleutians and the Bering Sea were impacted very early as people moved and came into North America. We mentioned the kelp forest and this guy, the sea otters, and their favorite food, the sea urchins. They do an incredible job of basically removing urchins, and if they didn't, we would not have this kelp canopy, because the kelp canopy is one of the first things that we see when we have overexploitation of sea otters, the loss of that canopy. And that's because we have what we refer to as a strong trophic cascade. We have the sea otter as the apex predator, the keystone species, whatever we want to label it, basically doing a real job on the sea otter, or sea urchins, which keeps the sea urchins from feeding on the kelps, which gives us a huge diversity of different invertebrate species, including larger fish and octopus, crabs, abalone, a very, just literal smorgasbord of potential shellfish, simply because of the presence of the sea otter in the system. We take that sea otter out, we basically disassemble that trophic cascade. With the sea otter gone now, the urchins multiply in numbers, they eat the kelps, the kelp disappears and takes with it the abalone, the crabs, the fish. The community becomes much, much less than it was initially through the simple removal of just this one species. And this was the idea with the Steller sea cow. You basically took out the otters, kelp went away, and you had nothing but sea urchins out there, and therefore the Steller sea cow starved because of the absence of the kelp. But let's go a little further. Let's go a little further back in time. Let's keep this perspective and this better resolution. Everybody agree that that's the disassembly of the trophic cascade? We've taken it apart? Well, let me ask another question then. How did we assemble it to begin with? If this is a disassembly, what does the assembly look like? Is there any information in the assembly that would be helpful to us in understanding kelp forest dynamics? Maybe it's a perpetual motion machine. Everybody knows about these. Now, here's Asa Jackson's amazing perpetual motion machine, for which he has a patent, I will add. It's the only way you get these good drawings. So with a perpetual motion machine, when you drop the last piece in, the machine starts running, and it runs forever. However, what was the last piece? And when we dropped it in, did we suddenly have a trophic cascade? Was this just spontaneously created? Like a perpetual motion machine when the last component comes in. Well, we take a different approach than imagining a spontaneous generation or creation of a trophic assemblage. What we do is we take all of the components and we break them down into time. Again, we're pulling back now. When did we see our different urchin groups come in? When did we evolve different kelps? The sea otters, the killer whales, our Steller sea cow, the cod, the sheep's head in Southern California, as well as the lobsters that make up the kelp forests of Maine and Nova Scotia. We can basically break down all of these interacting species, and of course, we end up with this creature at the very end, who sort of overrides everything that we've done previously. But our approach is basically to break it down into the origins. When did these things become part of the system? And we can tell that from the fossil record. The other thing we want to know is how are they related to one another? Because what we end up getting here is not only whether or not they have been diversifying recently or if they've been around for a long time, but we can also then look at the biogeography, the North Pacific, the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, and basically work out the biogeography from the history of the organisms, both through time, as well as how are they related in terms of their evolutionary history. This is what a kelp forest looks like. If you deconstruct it now and look at its assembly through time. Here are the major kelps when they start appearing in the system. One thing you'll notice is the kelps are very old. We pick up a commensal barnacle, which only lives on kelp stipes, and it agrees very nicely with our first occurrence of Neurocystis, which it lives on today. We can also put in major events, the opening of the Bering Straits, the mid-Pliocene warm period, and then again, the beginning of the glaciations right here. This phylogeny laid out here are for the important component of the sea otter interaction. This is the urchins, the strongly ocentrotid sea urchins. This is their radiation. And if you look at this, it's very interesting. Western Pacific and Eastern Pacific, maybe a glacier dividing them, and you end up with two populations. The other group which comes off at that point, Western Pacific, Eastern Pacific, and then look, as we get up into the more recent parts of the Ice Age, suddenly we're picking up the North Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic. There's the radiation of the sea urchins into that cold water during both Ice Age and interglacial, glacial and interglacial. There is the first occurrence of strong notice introduced in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. And here's our friend the sea otter. Notice how the system comes about. The kelps evolve first, then something to eat the kelps. The sea urchin comes in. And then lastly, the sea otter comes in eating the urchins. And you'll also notice that we have our friendly sea otter both in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. Our sea otter was in both oceans. But it is no longer, similar to the stellar sea cow, it is now extinct in the Atlantic, but not due to people. So this is the way the kelp forest looks like if you break it down into its evolutionary components and the fossil record over which it extends. So about 3 to 2 million years ago, relatively recently again, in the middle of the ice ages, our trophic cascade, the major components of it, first appear here. Very quickly, those same components are in the Atlantic. They associated just after the warm water period, which would have been a melting of the Arctic ice and allowing these animals in. The sea otter subsequently goes extinct, probably before humans are really up and running as a predator in Europe at that point. We don't know why, but the sea otter goes extinct. But that's okay. Remember, it is basically the apex predator. And as the apex predator, you take it away, the urchins are going to run wild. Except in the Atlantic, there's a new top predator, and that becomes the Atlantic cod. With the absence of the sea otter, the Atlantic cod basically becomes that top predator and controls the urchins, which allows the kelp beds to form throughout the North Atlantic Ocean. But we shouldn't feel bad as Pacific-philes because the cod came from the Pacific as well. But notice in the Pacific it never had the impact that it had in the Atlantic. And that's probably due to the presence of the otter, but probably more important due to the presence of sea lions and fur seals, which today directly compete with the Pacific cod. So again, depending on where you are and what time it is, in terms of the history, you have totally different outcomes. Now the otters, we almost lost them in the Pacific as well, thanks to the fur trade. Again, remember Bering is coming over and he's going through the Aleutian Islands and he's recording where the sea otters are. And all of that information goes back to the Russian Fur Company and they start sending over crews to basically take the otters out. This is the range of the otters that's reconstructed in 1740, before the great Russian, followed by American and English fur traders came in, all the way down here to Punta Eugenia in Baja California and to Hokkaido, Japan. By 1911, when the sea otter trade is finally winding down because there's almost no sea otters left, you're left with 13 populations of sea otters. The Kurils, Kamchatka, Commanders, Amchitka, Adak, Shumagans, Kodiak, Bristol Bay, Prince William Sound, Queen Charlotte's, Big Sur, and San Benito's Islands off Mexico. 13 populations of otters left after a relatively short, 250 years of basically hunting sea otters. But it wasn't the first time that they had been hunted. Again, the Aleuts and this maritime culture that was following the kelp highway were very, very good at hunting sea otters and whales and stellar sea lions and everything else as well. This is data worked up from the middens on Amchitka and Adak. And this starts down here at about 86 BC, 106 BC, 100 AD. So about 2,000 years ago. This is the remnants from the garbage pits where the food was thrown out. And as you look at this, what you start noticing is a very characteristic trophic interaction. Here, lots of fish, few fish, fish come back. Limpets, the only time you'll see limpets in the pond. Limpets, not very important. Very important when the fish are gone. Sea urchins, really, really important. Harbor seals, not so much. Sea otters disappeared. The aleuts were basically changing the trophic cascades, and it's reflected in what they were eating and what they had access to. As they would basically hunt out the sea otters, they would lose the harbor seals, they'd lose the fish, and they would switch over to sea urchins and limpets. You know, given your choice, would you like a nice piece of fish, or do you want a bunch of sea urchins and limpets to eat? It's obvious. Homo sapiens has the same dietary preferences, regardless of what time or where we're at. So, again, just like the stellar sea cow, notice we had this huge impact, and it was coming from the Aboriginal people that basically were riding the kelp highway and were establishing throughout the Bering Sea and through the Aleutians. But things got better. We passed the fur trade, or the Fur Seal Act, which protected sea otters. Sea otters were discovered in Big Sur again during the 1930s with the building of Highway 1, and the sea otters made this remarkable recovery. And at one point in the Western Aleutians, we probably had about 30,000 otters as we came into the 1970s and into the 1980s. When I first started in the Aleutians in 1979, these were incredible kelp forests that extended all the way back through these little rocky jetties and around these coves. It was just dense. You couldn't see the bottom, and there was so much kelp. This was what the Alaria kelp forests of the Aleutians were like, at least the ones I became familiar with. But by 2000, you'll notice that you have the intertidal here, but then as you get into 10, 20 feet of water, what you see is nothing but bare white boulders, no kelp. The kelp is gone. This is now dominated by sea urchins, and the sea otters have disappeared. This is what the data looks like. Amchitka, Adak, Kalagalaska, and Kiska. This is 100% of abundance from census data. Most of this data is the early 90s. Look, by the end of the 90s, we have lost over 80% of the sea otters from the Western Aleutians. They are gone. And when they have gone, we have basically reverted back to the urchin-dominated areas. 80% of the sea otters, 80% of 30,000 sea otters disappearing in 10 years. It almost sounds like the fur markets are back in again. But it wasn't the fur markets. It was one of our favorite marine mammals, the killer whale. Actually, the name was originally whale killer, as it was named by the whalers, because these animals were the scourge of whalers. They would get their whales, and they would get killer whales coming around and basically feeding on them if they didn't get them out of the water quickly. The killer whale eating sea otters seems strange. There was a smoking gun, and the smoking gun was on Adak Island. And it didn't make much sense at first, but it was Clam Lagoon. So if you look at Adak, which is the circles here, you'll notice that it very precipitous decline, down to about 20%. Well, most of that 20% of the otters that were left on Adak, they were living in Clam Lagoon. And this seems strange, because the otters out here had disappeared. But they were doing fine in Clam Lagoon. As a matter of fact, the population had increased slightly. Clam Lagoon was the panda's thumb, for those of you that are familiar with Steve Gould's writing. They were the exception that proved the rule. Could it be killer whales? When you look at the mouth of Clam Lagoon, the shoals that basically separated off are too shallow to have killer whales come in and feed on sea otters. This is what we think kept the killer whales out of Clam Lagoon. That's why the sea otters in Clam Lagoon were absolutely fine as long as they didn't move. The rest of the islands, 80% disappeared. This was a big surprise. Who would have thought that killer whales would suddenly start feeding on sea otters, which in fact meant there was no pressure on sea urchins and the kelp beds, there was no pressure from the sea otters, but there's tremendous pressure now from all these urchins, and the kelp disappears. You can look at these changes in biomass. Again, going from the late 80s, total kelp density in terms of number of plants per quarter meter squared, the grazing intensity of sea urchins, sea urchin biomass. Absolute huge increase, and again, following that reduction. This was the system that I learned about. This is what I taught. This is everything that we knew about trophic cascades of sea otters, and we were missing this guy. How is that possible? What did we do wrong? Well, Springer and Estes and others followed this up very quickly because they realized it wasn't just the sea otters. As you probably remember, back in the 70s and 80s, we also were seeing a tremendous loss of harbor seals and fur seals and sea lions from the Aleutians. And it was thought maybe there's a virus going on. Maybe it's overfishing. Well, it probably was this guy. It was probably the killer whales. And why did the killer whales suddenly remove, again, 80% of the harbor seals, the fur seals, the stellar sea lions, and then lastly, and then lastly, the sea otters? Was this a behavioral change? No. It probably was because we took their preferred diet away from them. And that was basically the whaling that started at the end of World War II and continued up into the 1980s. Okay, so Japanese were whaling, the Norwegians were whaling, the Russians were whaling. This was a way of building economic stability back into a world which had basically been devastated economically by World War II, especially this part of the world. But when you actually see these dots represent individual whales taken from the International Whaling Database. 1946, 1953 concentrated around Japan, the Western Aleutians, and down here off British Columbia. 54 to 62, the same areas, but now look at what's happening in the Aleutians and into the Bering Sea. That's our focus. This place is getting hammered. This food that the killer whales have been dependent on since their appearance has suddenly started to be reduced. 63 to 71, the final execution of the great whales from the North Pacific. And then lastly, 72 up until the moratorium. Now, much broader out into the Pacific, the whales are gone from this area. Killer whales have nothing to eat. They go after the next biggest thing. Maybe that's a stellar sea lion. Maybe it's a harbor seal. They have literally eaten their way down on the size gradients. And today, we're seeing it along our coast as the killer whales are now moving in and beginning to take gray whales in Monterey. Why Monterey? Because from Santa Cruz to Monterey is nothing but sandy beach. The whales can't come in and get in the kelp forest. They basically have to run across the bay. And there's a pod of killer whales, several pods now. Most of them originally derived from up off the coast of Washington, which are waiting for the gray whales and the calves to come down. We're going to see more of this because we've seen it in the past. So we ask the question, what's natural? What do we really think when we have what we're supposed to have, or what's evolutionarily stable, or what's ecologically required? If we look at cetaceans from that overhunting, this is historically what the biomass in millions of tons look like. This is what it looks like today. And the same thing with the pinnipeds. Tremendous reductions. And these are having, again, cascades that are going through the system. I want to switch gears a little bit now. We've been talking about trophic cascades and what's going on with predators. Well, I'll switch now and talk a little bit about the migrants, because that's another characteristic of the Bering Sea marine mammals. There's a lot of migration going on, and these are big classical migrations. Looking here at the northern fur seal, which today sits at a small place in terms of on the coast, as well as the Pribilofs. Again, St. Peter and St. Paul. These are the classic fur seal islands. This is where the Russians harvested. This is where the Americans harvested. You probably didn't know that we harvested fur seals until 1984 from both the Pribilofs and down near Bristol Bay. These are tracks of northern fur seals leaving the Pribilofs and moving down to their feeding areas. Some out here in the North Pacific Convergence, but notice most of them are coming along the coast, Oregon, Washington, and down into California. So these two rookeries, basically the animals are up here in the summer to breed, and then they turn around and go out and have these feeding excursions and move away from them. When they're breeding on the islands, they wean their pups in about 4 months, because this is what the summer looks like. This gives them the greatest success in reproductive time. The other migrant, of course, for the Bering is the gray whale. A magnificent animal, associated with the kelp forests as well, and rather unique among living whales in that it feeds on the bottom. It actually dives head first, takes a big mouthful of mud, strains out the amphipods and the small crustaceans, gulps that down, and disposes of the mud in the water. It has what is sometimes referred to as the longest migration of any mammal, from the breeding lagoons of Baja, California, all the way up the coast to the feeding areas in the Bering Sea and in the Chukchi. Today, the gray whale has this range, and of course this is the main part of the migration. There's another migration which occurs in the western Pacific, and there used to be a migration both in Europe and the United States, but that gray whale, the Atlantic gray whale, has been extinct at least since probably the 1300s or 1400s. Those are the last sort of medieval records of gray whales. But let's go back in time. Let's get that different resolution. Here's our world just about 15,000 years ago when the corridor was opened up between both the Laurentide and the Cordilleran glacial sheets. Here's the coastline for the Kelp Highway along the ice and some rocky outcrops of some islands which were not glaciated. But look at this area for the Pribilofs. Where are the northern fur seals? Here's the gray whale feeding area, probably under several meters of ice. What were they doing? What could have happened? We completely changed their world. And remember, this is only 15,000 years ago. This is literally yesterday. And we've got rid of the breeding areas, we've got rid of the feeding areas, we've got our glaciers all the way down here to Puget Sound. It's an interesting problem. We sort of look at this area. This is what it was like just 19,000 years ago. This is the Bering Land Bridge. There isn't much of a bridge. If you were walking across this, it isn't like you're looking at water on each side. As far as you know, you're in the middle of Siberia as you're coming across here. This happens, of course, because all of that ice, which isn't shown here, has got to come from somewhere, and that water comes out of the ocean, which pulls sea level down over 300 feet. Notice the shallow blue waters for gray whale feeding don't exist, and neither do the Pribilof Islands. And this area is filled. Now as we come through time, and we come up to the recent 16,000, 15,000 years ago, you'll notice that the area that the gray whales feed in today, the shallow areas are starting to appear. But we're down 6 meters now, so we're roughly 18 feet. And this is the area that is so important to the gray whales today. So what happened? We took that feeding area away from the gray whales. We took the breeding areas away from the fur seals, and not just those. The same thing happened to the stellar sea cows. The same thing happened to the harbor seals. Everything there, their world completely changed as the glaciers came in. And it just wasn't one glacier. This is what the Pleistocene looks like. This is ice-free. This is sea level down over 100 meters. In this case, down 120 meters. There are over 45 major excursions and ice age events going on in just the last 3 million years. It wasn't like they just rode this last one through and boy, everything's okay now because we're warming up the world. No, this was just one of many perturbations that these animals lived through. The oldest SRJC fossils are gray whales. 2.6 million years. The gray whales rode through all of this. The oldest fur seals, back here at 3.6. Again, they experienced this. This changed their world completely. But yet, we don't see extinction. What did they do? How did they do it? So this is the question that Nick Pynson and I took on. What do gray whales do during glacial maximum? What could possibly happen? So, we love the federal government. It turns out NOAA, and you can go online and download this data, it's just amazing data. NOAA basically has mapped the entire bottom of the ocean around the world. So you can literally get a half minute, a 30-second depth for every latitude, longitude crossing around the world. It's a huge database, so we downloaded it. And we asked a very simple question. How deep can a gray whale dive? And if you pull sea level down, how much feeding area do they have? And we did this throughout the entire Pacific Ocean to basically understand what happens when sea level changes. And here's sort of the results, and that's pretty interesting. So here's where we start, at the last interglacial. We're in an interglacial now. We haven't got up to plus 20, but we may by the end of the century. As we see how sea level starts to fall as the Earth starts cooling, you notice that all the bottom within 20 meters, between 20 and 40 meters, and 40 and 60 meters, changes dramatically. This is an interesting phenomenon. There's actually more sea bottom between 0 and 20 meters at roughly 100,000 years ago than there is today. It was kind of a surprise. We thought the bottom would be relatively level, but it's not. It's very chunky. But notice as we come, as sea level far as lower and lower, basically you have lost 40% of the gray whale, or down to 40%. You've lost 60% of the gray whale feeding depths are gone from the Pacific Ocean. So, what should have happened? Well, first thing you have to know is how much food do you need to run a gray whale? How much ocean bottom can you basically get food into? And so we made the calculation. Basically, to run a gray whale, you need about 366, so about 800 pounds of food a day to run a gray whale. And you're going to have to feed it for 180 days before it takes off and goes down to Baja, California. This is the density of the prey. This is the amphipods they eat. Roughly 161 grams per meter squared. This is a lot of diving, and it's a lot of feeding. And the food patch area in the Bering Sea is roughly 3,700 of the entire area in terms of square kilometers of the ocean bottom. Then you have to know the population size, because that's the question you're asking. Can you keep the gray whales surviving through the loss of sea bottom where they're traditionally feeding? Their feeding depth, they feed to 75 meters, however the average is only 30 meters. We use 75 meters to give them the benefit of the doubt. And this is what it looks like. And this is busy, and I will just point out a couple things that we can talk about. The first one, this red line, is basically the median population size over the entire glacial event. So this is the median population size that the whales would have been able to maintain. What's interesting here is you'll notice this gray shaded area, somewhere between 120K and just about 76K. This is the population estimate of gray whales based on their mitochondrial DNA. It is estimated by Steve Plumby at Hopkins and his student Elizabeth Alter that gray whale populations prior to whaling could have been as large as 76, maybe to 120,000 whales in the Pacific, and perhaps in the Atlantic as well. So this median becomes very important. So it's very busy on this side. Let's look over here. These are the non-glaciated areas. These are the areas where the gray whales could have continued to feed. You'll notice that we've divided it into the Western Pacific and the Eastern Pacific. The first dichotomy is the Western Pacific has much more potential bottom for gray whales. Even though that population is suffering today, the potential for feeding there is much larger than it is in the Eastern Pacific. These are estimates of population size only if the whales were basically feeding in the non-glaciated areas. And this is assuming that there's no limit. You can basically have no carrying capacity. You can just keep putting gray whales in there as long as they're food. And according to our estimates, you would have had a median population size of about 32,000 whales if they were just feeding on the bottom in the non-glaciated areas. However, some people have argued that the actual carrying capacity for the Pacific is only 22,000 whales, something we're relatively close to today. So let's assume that there was an upper limit, that you could only really have 22,000 whales in the Pacific. If we run those numbers in both the Western Pacific and the Eastern Pacific, the population sizes drop almost down to 1,500 whales, lower than the recovery after whaling. And of course, we see no sign of this in the molecular data whatsoever. So how did the gray whales do it? How did they apparently maintain these large population sizes, but they only had the non-glaciated areas to feed in, and there isn't enough sea bottom to basically get you up here to this number of whales? We can only really do about, what, at the most 2,500 whales over the course of that entire time? Why didn't the gray whales go extinct? We took away their food source, the sea bottom. Well, it turns out that the sea bottom is just one place where the gray whales feed. This is a gray whale off the coast of British Columbia in 2000, going through a kelp bed, taking mycetes. And this has been happening more and more. The gray whales are coming back. We're seeing more and more gray whales. We have more eyes. We have more whales. What are we seeing? We're seeing gray whales feed just like any other whale. They're going into the water column. They're taking fish. They're taking zooplankton. Basically, what we conclude is the way gray whales survived was they weren't stuck just feeding on the bottom. Today, the Bering Sea is there with this incredible bottom and this incredible feeding area, but it isn't the only way gray whales can make a living. They basically still maintain the ability to take food directly out of the water column. And feeding on the bottom is not just the gray whales. This Italian whale, approximately 11.6 to 7.2 million years ago, was also a modified jaw for feeding on soft bottoms. And so our gray whale is here, but it is surrounded by blue whales and also bight whales and minkies and the rest of the whales. It hasn't lost its ancestral ability to feed in the water column. What it basically does is it migrates now into the Bering Sea to take advantage of the sea bottom, but that's not its limit. It basically is still a good functioning, filter feeding water column whale. And it gets even more interesting, because over the past 10 years now, some gray whales are no longer migrating to the Bering. And again, if you're not stuck having to go there to get that food, well, maybe you stop in Northern California. They're also stopping in Oregon. These are basically populations of gray whales now, which don't spend their summer in the Bering Sea, but spend their summer off the coast of California, Oregon, Washington, and look around Vancouver. These are all populations of gray whales. We have one population up here at Sitka. What's interesting about this is, where are these whales sort of beginning to form these populations? It's at the edge of where the ice sheets were just 15,000 years ago. With the exception of Sitka, you may be seeing a return to those relatively recent ancestral homes where the gray whales migrated. And they've only started doing this since we stopped getting in boats and running out and sticking them every time they swam by the coast. Once you stop harassing the marine mammals, you start seeing them do things that you never anticipated. How do you make conservation decisions on something that has been literally hammered down, at least for our entire history, a couple thousand years in North America, as really big maritime hunters? And it gets better. Here's San Ignacio Lagoon, where the gray whales go to breed. Do they really need to go to the Mexican lagoons to breed? Doesn't appear to be. This is the increase in the number of whales with newborn pups going by, newborn calves, going by San Diego, Carmel, and Los Angeles, and you'll notice that spike. Gray whales are giving birth on the migration. They're not going into the lagoons. They're giving birth, and then they're hanging out in this California bike. They're not having to go to lagoons. So what's interesting about the lagoons? Well, the lagoons suffer from the same thing the Bering feeding area does. It basically disappears when you pull sea level down. Why the Mexican lagoons? Perhaps never a human population in southern Baja California that basically had people that would come out and hunt the animals when they went by. There was never a large population base of Homo sapiens. It was a safe place for the gray whales to go. So where's the two places they went? The Bering Sea with low human impact, and Baja California. What if the gray whale migration, the most magnificent mammalian migration, basically resulted because of human predation? It's a very different perspective to take on for the gray whales. And they're not done yet. 2010, this gray whale first shows up on May 8th off the coast of Israel in the Mediterranean. Shortly thereafter, about 22 days later, it's off Barcelona, Spain. And then in 2013, a gray whale swims down the coast of Namibia in southern Africa. They're coming back. They're doing the same thing that they did initially. They go into the Chukchi, they go into the Bering, and when the ice starts coming back, if it comes back, they basically make a mistake and turn right instead of left and end up in the Atlantic. Just like the sea otters, just like the kelp, just like the sea urchins. The Bering is a place where things start and then move on from. So do we have really facultative Bering migrants? This is something they choose to do, but it's not required. But we have to understand the plasticity. We have to be aware of this slightly different resolution of looking at them through time and thinking about what the Ice Age is meant to. Here's an animal that the Ice Age means a big thing to. And that's basically what we have with the walruses. Very, very small distribution, ice breeders. And this is an animal we're very concerned about, of course, as we go into global warming. This is what the fossil record looks like. And maybe it's a little bit of a surprise. They first appear back in the Miocene, along the coast of California, as well as Japan. We also see them moving during the Pliocene then, one Miocene record in Florida, the other one here in Belgium. We also see them moving up the coast, so we have both Atlantic odobenids as well as Pacific odobenids And as we come up into the Pleistocene for the glacial periods, we see them again on both sides. This is the family Odobenidae, the walruses. Today, of course, we only have one, but when you look back in time, you realize we only have one surviving walrus, but we had a huge diversity of Odobenids existing for much of the last 25 million years. Walruses were actually common, and lots of different species. One interesting thing about them is the tusk, of course, compared to our other pinnipeds, compared to sea lions, fur seals, harbor seals. Now notice that the tusks appear relatively late. These are the animals that have a tusk. And notice the tusks appear before glaciation. So the tusks don't seem to be part of the ice story. They probably are sexual display. They're probably basically a dimorphic way, or maybe male-male fighting to basically sequester females. But that's when they evolve. And so the idea today that the tusks are involved with digging up the sea bottom and pulling out invertebrates, they evolved perhaps, but more likely for sexual dimorphism and attracting mates. So here's the earliest walruses. They sort of look like a stellar sea lion skull here. And then we begin the big thick tusks. This is our living walrus today. All of these walruses with these tusks are extinct. But this is what the tusk really does today. It allows the animals to perch on ice holes. It allows the animals to pull themselves out of the water onto the ice by basically putting those tusks in, just like you'd use an ice axe to pull yourself up an icy slope. But did they evolve for this? No. They evolved for something else, but then look what happens when that glacial ice age starts. It's only the walruses with the tusks that basically make it through. They have an exaptation, a pre-adaptation to basically be successful. And two of them make it through. One in the Atlantic and our Pacific walrus. So we have Odobenus in the Pacific. We have Odocetus in the Atlantic on both sides. Unfortunately, we lose Odocetus 300,000 years ago. What's going on? Nothing. It's just one more ice age. But we lose Odocetus, and we have only Odobenus. Being a good-bearing marine mammal, what does Odobenus do? It basically goes into the Atlantic. So today, our walrus distributions are, again, a relatively new thing with the movement into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, these animals, again, as you've probably read, are really, really in trouble with regards to the ice. This is the Arctic sea ice extent. This is 2015. This is yesterday. And we're already more than 2 standard deviations below what the normal ice average should be, or even what it was in 2012. And so there's great concern about walruses and losing walruses because we lose the ice. This was from The Guardian. This was last year. This is what 35,000 walruses on a beach looks like. And this is what's going to become more and more common because they're going to be hauling out on these beaches. And so what do we do as a conservation issue? Well, we have a model. Most of us in this room have experienced a huge increase in elephant seals during our lifetime. When I first went to the Farallon Islands, there were 9 elephant seals. First time I went down on the wave up in the 70s, I think there were 100 on the wave up. 170,000 elephant seals today in the North Pacific Ocean. A huge comeback. And they're using beaches. And we've had to adjust how we use beaches and how we share beaches with elephant seals. So we have some models, we have some ideas. If I was in Alaska and I was working on walruses now, I wouldn't be worried about making plastic icebergs to float in the Bering Sea to give them a place to hang out. I would be clearing the beaches as much as I could to basically give them the beach space. Why? because they evolved initially to breed on rocky shores and sandy beaches. And I think like the gray whales, it's still in their genes. We just have to make sure we give them the space to be successful, to bring their numbers up. What we see them doing right now, whether it be migration or whether it be hauling out on the ice, may be just one little piece of a much larger repertoire which these animals have. But, and this is the big but, we have to be aware of ecological surprises. This paper came about because a bunch of us were sitting around and we asked the question, have you ever done an ecological experiment where you got the result you thought you would? And the answer unanimously was no. We were always surprised. So what we did is we sent out a questionnaire to 160 National Academy ecologists. And we said, have you ever done an experiment where you've been surprised by the results? 60% of them responded, which is pretty good. They're busy people. However, only one said, no, I've never been surprised. And I'll keep that name confidential. The fact is that we're always surprised. Whether it be the migrations, ecological surprises are in fact inevitable. And so we can have good models based on other species. And we can have a range of behaviors, migration, feeding. But we have to be careful because I guarantee you the animals will ultimately surprise us. So these are the groups. These are the marine mammals of the Bering. And I've given you a slightly different story than you usually hear about them tonight. And what I want you to do is think about them in terms of these stories, but only from the perspective of changing our viewing point. Whether we go back in time, whether we look at the relationships, we try to understand a bigger picture for these animals. This is what we could sort of summarize. First of all 4 marine mammal lineages are present. The otter, the penguins, the whales, the sirenians. They're all there. They have a diversity of origination times, both before and during the glacier. The glaciers aren't the panacea that basically brings about that diversity. Some are there before, they get co-opted into the system and they take on new roles. Ecological interactions include both in situ, where all the components basically evolve in order, or they can also be off the shelf, where an animal which was doing something prior to the evolution of kelp suddenly now becomes a major player in the kelp forest. They come to that position in the ecological interaction from very different starting points. Again, it tells us a lot about the plasticity of these animals. They've all experienced multiple global change events. It's altered their distributions. It's changed their life histories. When we look at the isotopes of the northern fur seals that were breeding down in Oregon and Washington just a few thousand years ago, we find out the pups stayed with their mothers for over a year. Today it's 4 months. That's huge. A year versus 4 months in one species over a period of a few thousand years. Their habitats have changed, whether they're feeding in the water column or on the bottom, and their diets change. Well, if they've experienced all these multiple events, why should we be worried about them? Are we spending all this money for no reason, worrying about conservation and what's going to happen to the gray whales or the fur seals? They've made it to it before. Why not just let them go with whatever we're going to do to this world and let them, tough it out? What's different this time is the rate of change. Last time it was over tens of thousands of years. We're changing the world now on a yearly basis. You can see the changes in the ice. That's what's different this time. But we still can use the data and the understanding from the past to try to reduce the amount of time we waste or the money we waste chasing answers or solutions that really don't fit within the evolutionary history of these animals or the place. Is the Bering Sea an origin or a destination? It's really both. Animals from the Bering Sea originate out of the Bering Sea into other parts of the world, but it's also a destination for a lot of migration today. The kelp highway, low chronic human impact, sometimes not so low with the loss of stellars as well as what went on with sea otters. We have been part of that system for a long time. probably well over 10,000 years. And lastly, what we learned from the Bering Sea marine mammals is migration is not essential. Migration seems to be a good thing that they're doing right now, but it's not essential to their survival. We need to be able to move to these other scales simply to address the impending global changes. We have to be able to bring this data together. We're about to be perturbed this world in a biotic and abiotic way that we have never experienced. And in some cases, with the exception of an asteroid coming in, it's happening so rapidly that we really have never seen anything like this before. And the challenge of global change is basically to move to these other scales and to be able to move effortlessly from ecology to paleontology to back to ecology, to take whatever we can to have a better understanding. This task that I've laid out would be impossible without the knowledge provided by natural history collections and research. And I am so happy to be standing here tonight in a natural history lecture because, you know, it isn't cell and molecular biology, although we use those tools, but it is really that natural history. It's what Peter Leveque and Bob Rubin basically have done here for so many years, which is so important, because without that natural history perspective, we really know nothing. And I'd like to finish with my favorite quote from the playwright Eugene O'Neill: "There is no present or future, only the past, happening over and over again, right now." Thank you.
David, we'll take a few questions, so feel free, and if we run out of time, feel free to come down and chat up David directly. So are there questions that we can take from the audience? Please.
Yeah. Back at the front end of your presentation, you touched on Bering's 2 voyages or routes that he took. My question was, why were his ships shipwrecked?
They basically hit a storm on the way back after they had been surveying the Aleutian Islands. And they were down to one ship at that point that basically was cast up on the beach. And he had lost, I think, he'd lost something in the neighborhood of more than half of his crew to scurvy at this point, so they really could only put a couple people on the deck. They get into the storm. There's no way of controlling the ship. The ship ends up going up onto the beach. And again, of course, Bering ultimately died there and didn't accompany his crew. And it's sort of like the mutiny on the Bounty story, getting into the longboat. Not as far in terms of getting back to Kamchatka and then ultimately back to Russia. And of course, George Steller gets back with him as well and describes all these incredible animals, as well as the sea otters ranges throughout the Aleutians, which then sets off, you know, the Russian Fur Company. And you've got to remember the Russians have been trapping furs and blue fox, even blue fox commercially in terms of blue fox farms, for hundreds of years throughout Siberia. These Russians were just outstanding furriers and fur trappers. And boy, suddenly, you know, this entire Alaska, Aleutian Islands is opened up, and they just stream in there. And according to the Commander Islands, become the staging point to basically get to the western Aleutians, Attu, Agatu, and then move through the chain.
Thank you.
All right, I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll adjourn, but please come down and chat with